What's going on, everybody? I am back and I have just redove into Diablo 4. Pretty excited about it, actually. And I have a really fun build that I've been using a ton recently to show you all. Really powerful, super strong CC rapid fire build. Let's get into it. All right, let's dive into the skills. And for those of you that want a written version, well, there's going to be a link to a max roll planner that a lot of you have asked for, and I decided to go ahead and do this time. And this is the fully updated version. So I did a previous video talking about kind of my theory craft and some things that I decided to go with or didn't go with. And here's the updated version. Now, this build can pretty easily clear 60s and 70s. I personally farm 70s when I do have the fully, upgraded version, which I've tested out on the non-eternal or non-seasonal realm, even though I'm not able to have all the eternal or seasonal things. But even if you don't have an optimized version, which I'm going to show you here today, you could easily run tier 60s without too much effort. The skills, however, we're running puncture just to get the 2 points into it. You don't use a basic in this build, which is really interesting. Rapid fire is the key. With improved rapid fire, you basically get infinite energy between this and the ability to apply vulnerable. And another thing that we're going to be using, we never ever have to do anything but spam out our rapid fire. We have shadow step here. This is very critical because it gives us a cutthroat skill, which we need later on, but also because it breaks CC and gives us a little bit of extra crit chance against bosses and just some movement. Dash, another one that's a cutthroat skill. Normally I don't run double movement skills because, well, when you get to those higher tiers, you start to farm, well, the double movement skills don't become as useful because you'd rather have some more damage or survivability. But for this, dash actually acts as our sustain and our survivability when we get later on in the build. Concussive, rapid gambits, trick attacks. This is pretty nice because concussive works with poison trap. Trick attacks gives us the knockdowns, which works with our aspect. Weapon mastery is just going to give us a ton of additional damage. And then rapid gambits. This is very important with the mechanic for the build, which I want to show you all as we showcase it. But it actually works super well to kind of reset some rapid fire shenanigans. Poison trap, this is super useful just to give us a little bit of a knockdown and potential chance to refresh our imbuements. But the knockdown is where we're mainly using that. And then we also have the passives here. So we are running Consuming Shadows and Shadow Crash. This works with the Barber to give us extra energy when we kill people. Super useful there. Precision Imbuement. This works with our Cold Imbuement, giving us extra crit chance. Cold Imbuement is the imbuement we're going for. This is a little bit surprising because many of you may have realized that, well, I don't really use Cold Imbuement that much. And that's because I don't necessarily like it all that much. But I found that Poison Imbuement doesn't really synergize with the Barber as much as I'd like. So I tend to avoid Poison Imbuement. And Cold Imbuement is the one that's really shined for me. Just the amount of damage and CC, which I really like, has popped off for me. Of course, we are running Debilitating Toxins as well as Deadly Venom and a point alchemical advantage. This just works with Poison Trap. And then Frigid Finesse for the extra damage that we're pumping out. We're going to be using Shadow Clone. This is really nice just to get an additional Cold Imbuement out with our aspects, as well as just doing way more damage with rapid fire. And on a plus side, it actually gives us unstoppable. We also have Trap Mastery giving us extra crit chance with our Poison Trap. And then here is the thing that ties this build all together, and that is momentum. Now, momentum, you might be surprised that we're using it because only cutthroat skills can grant stacks of momentum, and rapid fire is a marksman skill. So how do we activate it? Well, we have to hit a stunned, dazed, or frozen enemy, or we have to hit a enemy from behind with our cutthroat skills. Well, fortunately for us, we can easily freeze people with Cold Imbuement. We can easily daze people with trick attacks, and we can very easily hit people from behind with Shadow Step. So the idea with this build is we Shadow Step constantly and we dash constantly, not because we're using it for mobility, which you can, but because we want to reset our stacks of momentum, which is going to give us a massive amount of movement speed, energy regeneration, and most importantly, the damage reduction. This is critical. It also synergizes with an aspect, which we got to dive into now. Let's talk aspects, starting off with the helmet. So as I was just referring to the momentum, this is one of the key reasons to run momentum. Every stack of momentum, which we can very easily get 3, is going to heal us for roughly 250 with my aspect, but you can increase this even further. So that means 750 health heal every second. If we look at our base HP, or I guess we can see our total HP here, that is about a 10% HP heal every second. This is a massive amount of sustain, and with Siphoning Strikes being the trash passive that it is for most situations, this is going to be a great way to get some extra sustain here. We're going to be running the Mangler's aspect for extra dazes on vulnerable enemies. This works with our trick attacks and all the skills that proc off of daze. Imitated imbuement here, this allows our shadow clones to apply cold imbuement. We have the Umbrus. This gives us extra damage reduction when we hit with our critical strikes on our rapid fire. We can have a chance to get Dark Shroud. Now, Dark Shroud works really well with this just to give us extra damage reduction. You can, if you want to, put some extra points into Dark Shroud to get the effects of it. Things like the extra chance to not be consumed or the subverting / countering Dark Shroud. However, I found that they just drop off very quickly because I'm not really building around it. I'm just trying to negate some of the damage that I'm taking. Penitent Greaves, these are so good. A lot of people are like, how am I chilling people? This is how you chill people. Also, we have the cold imbuement, but this just chills everyone that you step over, which is super, super nice. Disobedience aspect on the amulet for extra armor. Accelerating ring, we really want critical strikes giving us course attack speed, because attack speed is the name of the game with this build, and I'll explain why in just a second. Vengeful, giving us extra crit chance. We also have the Edge Masters because we're going to constantly have near max or max energy. And then Blast Trappers because we will be applying Poison Trap all the time. And this is another way to activate vulnerability. And lastly, we have the repeating aspect on the two-hander because we want to have that rapid fire ricochet. It gives us even more viability with our hearts. Now, earlier I mentioned accelerating aspect, and let's talk about some of the stats and gear. So I'll just briefly go over some of the gear and stats here. As I mentioned, this is the D4 planner. So if anyone wants to check out and use this as a representation of, whatever stats you want to go for, do so. But generally speaking, we're looking for just all the different options to give us extra damage reduction, as well as amplifying our current skills that we're using. So cooldown reduction on the helm, damage reduction on the chest piece and on the pants. For the gloves, we want that attack speed, we want the rapid fire, we want the critical strike chance. For the boots, well, they're the boots. Amulet, we want damage reduction. Frigid Finesse passive, this works really well because we are going to be chilling / freezing everyone all the time. You can go with energy reduction on this one. That's also kind of works in some scenarios, but most of the time you don't even need it. On the rings, critical strike chance, damage, the drill. Weapons, for the melee weapons, you want swords because the other ones give you close damage and you're not always close. So while you tend to stay to close enemies, so you can go ahead and take advantage of that, you're not always, so swords are significantly better. And lastly, we have the bow, critical strike damage, all stats, vulnerable damage. But this is very, very key. You'll notice it says bow and not crossbow. This is very, very, very important. Crossbows are 0.9 attacks per second. That means it is a very, very slow attacking weapon. Now, there's ways you can negate this with rapid fire, but rapid fire is a very slow attacking skill because you have to channel through it all. You can cancel that animation, which I'll show you later, but this is going to help us pop off more rapid fires and just allow us to maneuver around the battle significantly easier. You will notice a difference between a crossbow and a bow. Even though crossbows give you vulnerable damage, I'd rather have a bow just for the attack speed, and the distant damage does come in clutch every once in a while. Now let's talk gems and hearts. We are going for rubies in our armor this time. The reason for this is I found just generally having more maximum life with the sustain is going to give us more survivability. I don't find myself being CC'd almost ever, and if I am, I have Shadow Step to break out of it. I like rubies a little bit more. Emeralds here, critical strike damage to vulnerable enemies, everyone knows. As for hearts, the first one I want to talk about is the Vicious Heart here. And I have critical strike actually electrically charge enemies, basically arcing lightning and doing damage to everyone. I found this to be interesting, but realistically, I would recommend you go with the Tempting Fate, which is going to give you extra critical strike damage, but it's going to make your normal attacks less viable. It does less damage. The thing with this one is that you don't really want to run it unless you have all the pieces, unless you have high crit strike chance rolls, unless you have the kind of more optimized setup. Otherwise, you have so many other options, and this one is one, or you can go with basically any other option. The vicious and the brutal hearts are less, I guess you'd say, interesting compared to some of the other ones. But the brutal heart here, the revenge one, is the one exception, and that is one you're going to want to run. It gives you just straight up damage reduction essentially, although it works a little bit differently because it's a different buckets, it looks like. So very, very strong. Next heart, we are running the barber. This makes rapid fire an AoE skill with the ricochet, as well as the explosions here. So between repeating aspect as well as the barber, we're going to get AoE hits, and it just makes everything run so much smoother. Real quick, I want to talk about our specialization, and we are using preparation. Now, inner sight, not necessary. You don't need the energy. Combo points can be interesting, but we're not using a basic skill. So literally, there's no need for any of these, and we're running preparation. And in fact, even if we could use combo points or inner sight for effectiveness, I still think preparation is going to be a little bit better. You really want Shadow Clone all the time, and reducing that cooldown super nice, and you're going to be spending energy very easily because we basically have permanent rapid fire attacks. So you're just going to be constantly applying attacks here. And something like energy cost reduction could potentially make your build worse if you have preparation running, because you're going to reduce the amount of energy you could spend with each rapid fire, which ends up being less good for your cooldown reduction for your ultimate. So you have to weigh those and determine whether or not you find yourself low on energy. Maybe you do go for energy cost reduction, but if you don't, then you don't want energy cost reduction. And for me, for example, my amulet currently has a really good energy cost reduction roll, and I'm finding it to be a detriment to the build. So something you need to consider. Now let's head over to the planner once again to talk about the Paragon, because I do not have my Paragon completely maxed out right now. So, well, I'll show you here. First off, we have the Ranger glyph with the start nodes. This is going to give us extra damage reduction when just playing the game. We also have the next board, which is going to be no witnesses plus exploit. This is going to give us a chance to apply vulnerable when we hit enemies that haven't been hit with this, in 20 seconds. We also just get extra vulnerable damage. Third board, we have the exploit weakness plus combat. Now, I will note for these two boards, by the way, you want the no witnesses legendary node to give us extra damage when we pop our shadow clone. And then also for here, whenever we deal damage to a vulnerable enemy, they're going to just scale up the damage that they take from us, which is really, really nice. We also have the combat glyph. This is going to give us a massive amount of critical strike damage and just increase our energy regeneration, which is very good because we don't want to necessarily reduce the costs, but we still want to get our energy back. So that's still super, super useful. On for the fourth board, we have the deadly ambush plus turf. Deadly ambush, well, guess what? We're going to be applying our poison trap super often because preparation is going to be resetting our skills when we use our ultimate. So we can oftentimes poison trap, prep with our ultimate, then poison trap again, get extra critical strike damage. And guess what? Turf. We want to stick close to enemies, but not always will be. But when you are, you're going to get a massive damage reduction and more damage. Lastly, we have the cheap shot board, and this is just going to give us a massive amount of damage towards crowd control enemies with the control glyph. This is going to be huge, especially since we are freezing enemies very consistently with our cold imbuement. Now, I wanted to make this build, but I wanted to do it with lower level glyphs, so I could show you all that you don't necessarily need maxed out glyphs to really be effective in here. Now, I do have a couple maxed out glyphs because I did max them out, so just to show realistic results, like my combat glyph is maxed out, for example. However, what you'll notice is this one right here, my exploit glyph is actually at level 10, and my ranger glyph is actually at level 4. So there is a massive amount of improvement that you can make for this build with these glyphs alone, but also with the gear and all the other stuff associated with it. So you can see here, I don't even have access to the deadly ambush node or my 5th Paragon board. So there's a lot of things that you can improve about this build, and I wanted to show you all this because a couple of you have been asking, hey, how viable is this for middling players, those players that are just breaking into? How hard is it to actually develop this build? It's really not that difficult, which is why I think it's so impressive that we can actually pretty easily farm tier 60s and 70s, and that's where we got to talk about the showcase of this build. Before we dive into the tiered dungeons, I want to show you all a quick mechanic with rapid fire that is going to be incredibly important if you want to maximize this build, and it can kind of be hard to see because you don't always use this mechanic, because sometimes you want to keep up your dodge, but also there's just a lot of things around the map. So when you use your rapid fire, you'll notice that you're stuck in place. So I'm going to shoot rapid fire and then immediately press to move, and you can see that I'm kind of stuck in place for like maybe half a second to a second. And what you could do is, instead of sitting in place, you can actually dodge out of it, and it resets / cancels your animation. So if you go ahead and dodge, you could see that you're actually shooting and you're still, or you're dodging and you're moving and you're still shooting. So if I dodge, you could see it's still shooting and I'm able to move. So that is a huge mechanic. And what's also cool about it is if you dodge, you can actually just immediately shoot out another rapid fire. So this ends up being an kind of like an auto attack cancel / an auto attack reset. So you can go ahead and dodge and then shoot out multiple rapid fires, which can pump out additional damage, which actually becomes super useful for bosses if you do remember to do so, which sometimes, you know, you're lazy and you just want to farm and chill out, and, you know, you don't want to do that. But for when you're really trying to stay alive, you can dodge out of those abilities and not lock yourself in place. And when you want more damage, this actually gives you more damage, which is something that you're really going to want to know. So how is this build in actual Nightmare Dungeons? Well, as you can see behind me, we're on a tier 64, which isn't like the most insane thing ever. But one thing you'll really notice about this build is the amount of sustain and ability to survive it has while just kind of just chilling and normally farming. By the way, that little lightning strike is that heart. It's not too crazy, but it does do a little bit of extra things. So one thing that we really will note about this build is, ironically, the single turret damage is super high, but the AoE damage becomes higher with more enemies around it. So while you want a single target, you also want a single target while you have more enemies nearby. And what you'll notice down here, right next to me, is the little skull plus the little arrow passive. It's 3 over on the bar. That is your momentum stacks. Now, I don't always do a great job of keeping it up, and you can see right there when it's down, you do take big chunks of damage. But when it's up, you significantly reduce that, because that is the momentum stacks, right? When you have those up, you have 20% damage reduction, which is going to be super massive. And you can see here, if you are struggling a little bit, you take those big hits, or you have momentum down, you could potentially lose a little bit of energy as well. But not only are you going to get that massive damage reduction, most of the time, and more importantly, you're actually just going to get a massive amount of healing from it, which is really nice. And you'll notice here that you really want to try to keep up those melee skills, because they generate the momentum very quickly. And this was literally just a casual run. I'm not super try-harding here. I'm just kind of casually farming. I did hours of this the other day, and it's quite easy to keep up the stacks, with only every once in a while popping off a dash or a momentum or a shadow step for those hits. Another thing you're going to want to remember is, because the shadow clone resets your abilities, you want to use your cold imbuement and your poison trap before popping your ultimate, so you can reset that. Another thing to remember is that your shadow clone will apply your cold imbuement as well. So when you go ahead and use your cold imbuement, you want to try to pair it with your shadow clone, so you can get double the effectiveness, which ends up being really good. On top of that, when you're using your poison trap, remember that's going to knock down enemies and also give you the poison trap passive, which gives you extra critical strike chance. That's super important as well. One last thing is that you can freeze enemies really easy and CC enemies really easily. With the Mangler's aspect, as I mentioned earlier, when you hit a vulnerable enemy, you're going to have a really easy chance to lay down some additional CC, which is going to help you out a ton with just dealing with random trash. But how does this build do against bosses, you might ask? Well, with the boss HP increase, I'm actually quite starting to notice it as I dive into the higher tiers. And so honestly, the builds that I've been using recently, unless you're fully spec'd out to deal with the boss, you're going to just take a little bit longer as we expected. But one thing that's really nice about this build is the CC break bar potential, as you can see up there. Although a little bit of bugged out here. For some reason, I couldn't break it a second time. I broke it earlier on into the video here. Where was it? It was like right here. You could see the break bar, and you kind of want to line up your shadow clone to where you have it up during the break bar, because you're going to get more damage. Now, It's also important to note that I don't have the glyph activated right now, which gives me extra damage against crowd controlled enemies, because I'm not min-maxing this build right now. I'm just showing you all what the mass capability of it is on a pretty difficult tier for most people. And so you have so much potential for this, but getting that crowd control down gives you so many more options to do more damage. Still solid against bosses, but just in general, bosses are tougher, so they're going to take a little bit longer. Overall, though, that is the build. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. I know I've been really enjoying it, and as I dive deeper into season 1, because I've had a sort of renewed interest, and maybe I'll make a video about that more recently or in the future, I would like to go ahead and showcase these builds on the tier 100s that they could potentially do, so you guys can see kind of what the actual maximum capability of these builds can be. But until then, these are going to be stellar farming builds and will help you all complete that journey. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.